This lecture will look at the 1950s in the United States and how affluence, poverty, and civil rights marked part of the history of those times. This is sometimes called the Affluence Society, and this period takes its name from John Kenneth Galbraith, an economist's look at the post-war economy. His book, 1958, called The Affluence Society, Galbraith said that after the war, the economy was largely based upon supplying people with not what they needed so much, but with what they wanted. Desire fed by advertising, so market-created desire. But the problem is, as he saw it, was this is going to lead to inequity between those who can afford to buy more and those who can't afford to buy as much of their wants. He said that in post-World War II America, our needs were being met, but we were now spending money on wants. After World War II, a lot of the economic boom was based upon what had happened during the war. Now, World War II, we say, ended the Great Depression because the federal government really stimulated the economy by providing jobs for people either going into the military or working in war production. It also regulated the economy because there were a lot of organizations and government associations like the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization that regulated where money was being spent so that the needed parts, the needed goods, the needed services were going to the right areas. You also had people who were buying a lot of war bonds. The government was really pushing for people to invest in war bonds, and this was people putting their money into a savings account because this would come back later on. And the war bonds were to help fund the military and economic growth and stimulation of the economy. And so when those war bonds were invested and then later on redeemed after the war, it was pumping a lot of money into the economy. Also, you had the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also called the GI Bill of Rights, which was provided for servicemen and women following the war to help them reestablish their lives that they had put on hold, many for years. And so this was providing for education, low-cost loans for housing, people wanting to learn new trades, or people wanting to start businesses. And also, during the war, tax rates really went up, especially among the wealthiest people. And we say we had a tax rate of about 94%, but understand that was on income. And a lot of times there were loopholes in the taxing structure that even if you were very wealthy, you could find ways of knocking that rate down. But it was stimulating the economy by pumping money back into the economy, and that's what keeps an economy going. After the war, we also saw a lot of urbanization. And this is a picture of Levittown, New York, which was one of the most celebrated and well-known of the suburbs that grew up after World War II. Many people were moving into the suburbs, and these were areas outside of the city proper. Many people had been coming into the urban areas for city. They couldn't always find housing during the war. Once the war is over, and as more and more housing developments are growing, they're being built in the rural areas, and so many people are then overflowing into these places. And this is a lot of reason that these agricultural areas are now becoming open is because during the war, mechanization, during the Great Depression, there had been a decline in agricultural work, also during the war. So the suburbs grew, and they grew tremendously following the war. By 1960, a little under one-third of the population lives in suburbia. And part of this is also due to white flight. Places like Levittown were segregated. Urban areas, inner cities, were seen as the province of minorities and ethnic groups. And especially after Brown versus Board of Education and schools were integrated, you have white flight, and these were affluent white middle-class families leaving the inner cities and moving out to the suburbs. And with the development of automobiles and the popularity and spread of automobiles, transportation for them became a bit easier. And because of the growth of the suburbs and because of the growth in these urban areas, it's going to demand electricity. And so in a lot of areas, sometimes called Sunbelt states, these were areas in the South and Southwest after the war that see a tremendous amount of growth. You need dam building because dams on rivers generate electricity. And so the 1950s is kind of the golden age of dam building, and a lot of it's to provide electricity for areas like Los Angeles. You also see the increased opportunity for consumer credit, and especially in credit cards, the development of credit cards. The first modern credit card, and you've got an advertisement here for Diners Club. They had the first, what we would call, credit card. So what this does is it makes money available so that consumers can buy household goods, they can buy liquor, they can buy flowers, as the advertisement says, or they can buy televisions, they can buy refrigerators because they have easier access to credit. Automobiles also benefited from this as well. And so people were buying more and more automobiles, and you can see this reflected in the need in 1956 for the Interstate Highway Act. And this is what gives us highways like 10, 35, Highway 45 here in Texas, but highways across the United States. It was done on a military needs basis because after the war, we said, well, how do we transport military personnel, munitions, and other military needed supplies across the United States? Because roads weren't very good uniformly. Some places had good roads, some places didn't. So the Interstate Highway Act was to provide limited access, high-speed travel, and this fuels the growth of the automobile industry. Also, because people were buying more cars, other industries were benefiting. Now, for cars, you needed steel, you needed rubber, sometimes leather, petroleum, of course, safety glass development, electronics, all of that to go into build cars. The industries associated with the building and production of automobiles, the buildings associated with laying roads, you need gravel, you need asphalt. All of these are going to benefit. And also, of course, the oil industry. There's going to be a greater and greater need for petroleum. And another that we don't often associate with another contingent industry was fast food and hotel, because as people were traveling more and they're going to be taking advantage of these highways, they want to make sure that they have recognizable places to eat. Sometimes you went into small towns and the only place to eat, maybe it was segregated. Maybe it didn't offer food that you liked. Maybe it cooked it in an odd way. You don't want to get sick. Also, hotels, you wanted some consistency in what you were getting. So you knew that a certain hotel had good, clean rooms, freshly changed linen on their beds, and a standard of service. And you wanted the same thing. Hotels, you wanted it in fast food, and to an extent, you even wanted it in your gas stations. I mean, look at today's popularity of stations like Buc-ee's. People will go to Buc-ee's because they know what they're going to get is going to be clean. So places like Holiday Inn, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken, Pizza Hut, Dunkin' Donuts, these are a few of these chain businesses, fast food hotels that became popular after World War II. Popular culture also changed. I'm going to talk about two specific items here. One is religion, and the other is the baby boom itself. We know that after the war, and we mentioned this in the previous lecture, that religion in the United States became more important following the war. And Billy Graham, a minister, began doing nationwide crusades in large cities where he would travel around like concerts today and invite people to come to these crusades that would draw thousands and thousands of people, fill up stadiums and arenas. And this started in 1947, and Graham became very influential, not only among the American people, but among politicians as well. And he counted among his friends numerous presidents. Almost every president from the 1950s on, while Graham was alive, would often advise them. You also had the idea of that religion was also for positivity. And so a minister by the name of Norman Vincent Peale wrote a book called The Power of Positive Thinking, where he talks about how religion is good for your mental health, a day-to-day improvement for your life. And we also see the role of religion in the civil rights movement. Many of the civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King Jr. and others, were religious leaders. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Martin Luther King Jr.'s organization, was built around ministers. And so religion played a large role in civil rights. Another topic that affected popular culture is the baby boom. This was an increase in children being born following the war for a variety of reasons. Maybe it was the nuclear family. Maybe it was people returning from war. Maybe it was in more spendable income that people had. For many reasons, children increased following the war. And so people were beginning to pay more and more attention to how they raise those children, and different concepts of childcare began growing up after the war. And one of the most popular, one of the most influential, was a man named Dr. Benjamin Spock, and his book, Baby and Childcare, that thousands and thousands of women across the United States picked up and read to learn how to new techniques and better ideas on training children. The youth culture also changed because there was more money available to spend, because of more disposable income. Young people now could spend money on things like comic books. And so you see the development of many of the comic books. Some of them had been radio programs before. These superheroes had been radio programs, and now they were being developed into comic books. And this also took on other aspects of reaching out to this growing young audience. And you see it in music and other cultural activities as well, movies, television. And speaking of television, look at the growth in television following World War II. Television had actually been introduced in 1939 at a World's Fair, but it had grown slowly during the war years. After the war, you see a dramatic jump in the decade of the 1950s, whereas right after the war, only about 12% of the population owned a TV, yet by 1960, almost 90% of American families had at least one television. And in the television programming that you saw, and a lot of this is because it starts very slowly at first, a few television stations, a few available channels and programming, the programs were made to appeal to as broad an audience as possible, very consensus-oriented. They didn't want to introduce anything that would upset people or that would challenge traditional roles. And so you see very traditional families, this idea of the nuclear family, white middle-class values, and in shows that became popular during the years, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, the Ed Sullivan variety show, Milton Berle, Mr. Television, as he liked to call himself, a comedian in his variety show. Leave It to Beaver was another family-oriented show. And then for children, you had shows like Captain Kangaroo and puppet shows, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. You also had variety shows, and game shows became very popular. Like the most popular one of the time was the $64,000 question. So people were beginning to watch more and more television. And as you can see from this picture from the early 1950s, television sets at the time were very, very small. So people had to crowd in to see them. And so this reinforced the idea of family. And some of the entertainers that came out of this are also reflected of the youth culture of the time. People like Buddy Holly and rock and roll and Elvis Presley were real game changers in the music industry. You had very popular actors and actresses like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, Marlon Brando, who came at age of this. And in many of the movies, they also reflected the concerns of the period. One of those concerns that you see sometimes in television or in movies was the idea of conformity and this idea of consensus, that everybody had to be alike. A psychologist who was actually from the Houston area named C. Wright Mills talked about the power elite, that there were growing forces in society and organizational power in society that were kind of setting the stage and ruling and telling the rest of society what to do. People also felt ideas after the war, ironically enough, of isolation, that they were lonely. And so you have books like The Lonely Crowd, The Organization Man. And there was a very popular book and movie, and here's a picture of Gregory Peck in this, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. This is the idea that people all looked alike, they all dressed alike, and some people felt that true art was being destroyed by this consumer-driven culture of desire that John Kenneth Galbraith talked about, that because people had more disposable income, they could buy things they wanted. And so art, which at one time was financed by patrons, by wealthy patrons, now it was being driven by mass consumerism, and so we were losing the idea of art. You also had a whole generation of writers that came out of this period. This was known as the Beat Generation. And some of these writers included people like poets Allen Ginsberg or writers like Jack Kerouac, who were talking about and kind of reacting against this conformity that Americans felt and were concerned about. You also had new directions in politics, and one of these was the so-called New Right. Conservatives and moderate Republicans had split in the 1950s, and the conservatives took more of a stance illustrated and represented by Senator Robert Taft of Ohio. On the other hand, you had the more moderate, more sometimes called the liberal wing of the Republican Party, and this was led by Thomas Dewey, who had run against Truman. Nelson Rockefeller was kind of the model of the more moderate Republicans, sometimes called Rockefeller Republicans. And then Dwight Eisenhower. President Eisenhower was a moderate. He was concerned about conservatives taking over, and so he decided to run for the presidency and won. And so he kind of has this middle road presidency, as it's sometimes called, a more moderate version of republicanism. You also had the growth of people who call themselves libertarians, and these are people who are more concerned about individuality, and this is growing out of this concern for conformity that they were seeing in the nation around them. One of their spokespersons was a novelist who wrote a couple of books of fiction called Ayn Rand. And Ayn Rand, and her picture is right here on the screen, wrote a novel called The Fountainheads during the war, and then later on her most famous novel is Atlas Shrugged in 1957. She had been born in Russia and was very critical of communism, but also liked the idea of individuality, and so she has kind of become the spokesperson for many of the libertarian ideas, or at least the intellectual thought leader for a lot of the libertarian ideas that came out of the 1950s. And you also see some people in the Republican Party who are more concerned about anti-communism and one world government conformity in global interactions, and so they did not want to join the UN, the United Nations. They did not want participation much with outsiders. They wanted more of an isolationist, and they did not like civil rights. And this was a group known as the John Birch Society, which started later in the 1950s. As far as civil rights are concerned, two people were very prominent coming out of the war and into the 1950s, and that was A. Philip Randolph, who you see on the left side, and Bayard Rustin on the right. And these two gentlemen had been active in civil rights. A. Philip Randolph was the president of the Sleeping Car Porters Association. This was an African-American union made up of men who worked on the railroads, who worked as porters, who would help people and take care of people while they were on the train. And this was an elite society and a well-paid job for many African-American men. And so this was an important, influential organization. We saw that in the war, and actually before the war, going back to the New Deal, there were some entrenched racist segregationist policies that were adopted by government organizations. And a lot of this was based upon the residential security maps put out by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then used later on during the New Deal by the Federal Housing Administration. This is sometimes known as redlining. And these maps, a lot of times they were basically for insurance purposes, put in red neighborhoods that were oftentimes poor or high minority neighborhoods. And so this idea of redlining kind of reinforcing segregation and structural racism, because it was harder for people who lived in those neighborhoods to get loans. They also didn't get a lot of fire or police protection. Right on the eve of World War II, the German ship, the St. Louis, came to New York with Jewish people who were fleeing Nazi-occupied Germany and Europe. And they came to the United States looking for asylum. And when the ship docked at New York, we refused to allow these people to come on board. And so many of these Jewish refugees were sent back to Germany, where they perished in concentration camps and death camps. There was also the Double V campaign, and this was started by an African-American newspaper in Pittsburgh, and it was a victory at home against segregation as well as victory abroad against fascism. So this double victory, Double V campaign. And A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, who I mentioned earlier, developed an idea because of segregation they saw in America, and this was the March on Washington movement. It started in 1941. They went to President Roosevelt and said, look, there's segregation, limited opportunities for African Americans in the armed forces and in government contracts. And as a result of this threatened March on Washington, he issued an executive order 8802 in June of 1941, which established a Fair Employment Practices Commission and outlawed segregation among military contractors. So businesses supplying the military had to integrate. Part of this led to concerns and trouble in a lot of the war industries. And so in places in Beaumont, Texas, in Mobile, Alabama, Detroit, Michigan, Los Angeles, California, Harlem, New York, in 1943 saw a wave of race riots where whites were attacking minority communities, largely because of integration was adding more African Americans to the workforce. Also during the war, because the nation was almost at full employment and because so many farms had been lost during the Depression, there was a need for farm workers. And so we looked to Mexico to provide migrant workers to come in during seasonal migratory workers to come in, and this became known as the Bracero program. And it was for areas like California, certainly, and Texas, but also other areas where agriculture was needed, agricultural help was needed, Arizona, on up into Michigan, in the central states, wherever agricultural worker was needed, these migrant farm workers were brought in to help fill that gap where there weren't enough people to pick crops. However, Texas was excluded from this for a number of years because of high rates of discrimination and segregation that were reported. One example of this is in the Sleepy Lagoon case. This is 1942. A Mexican-American teenager was killed in an area of Los Angeles, area outside of Los Angeles. It was blamed upon other Mexican gangs, and the court case was filled with racist innuendo and speculation. There was little evidence to convict the people, but a lot of it was done based upon, well, this is how Mexicans behave. They like to knife people, and this kid was killed by a knife. Very little hard evidence, a lot of it racial speculation. And then shortly after this, you do have the race riots in Los Angeles, sometimes known as the Zoot Suit riots in 1943, where white members of the military, usually Navy, were attacking a lot of young Hispanic and African American and Filipino young people who were in competition for jobs and other issues. The Congress of Racial Equality, one of the oldest civil rights organizations, was founded in 1942 by young people involved, a lot of them in religious studies in Boston and other places in the North. And they became very active throughout the 1960s, and we'll read about them later on. Also, another issue that came about was Japanese internment. Following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the West Coast, usually Oregon, Washington, or California, were herded up and put into camps. They lost a lot of property. They lost a lot of income. They lost almost everything they owned. They could only take stuff that they could carry with them, usually a suitcase or two, and whole families, children, grandparents were included in this roundup and and the government put them into these relocation camps. And this was a deep concern among many civil rights activists during the war years. Towards the end of the war, civil rights did score a victory in the Supreme Court case Smith versus Allwright. This was a case out of Texas, where Texas had an all-white primary, meaning that African Americans couldn't vote in the primaries. This was challenged because Texas was a one-party state. The Democrats had control of virtually all the offices, and so it was really a matter of who won the primary election, because the Republican Party was so weak at the time that whoever won the Democratic primary was going to be the office holder, because they very rarely faced a strong, or even sometimes even at all, a Republican challenge. So excluding African Americans from the primary was essentially not allowing them to vote at all. After the war, you see an increased attention towards civil rights, and a lot of this was because the civil rights issues were taking on national and sometimes international status, and people around the world were learning of racial discrimination in the United States. In 1947, one of the earliest victories after the war was the desegregation of baseball, when Jackie Robinson, an African-American baseball player, joined the previously all-white Brooklyn Dodgers. And this was a changer for a lot of sports. Also, Executive Order 9981 in 1948, President Truman officially ended discrimination in the military, not just in contractors, as Roosevelt had done, but in the military as well. And so you do still see some segregation going on, but it starts to end. A couple of other things going on in 1948, and they're not really related to the executive order, but to show you that there were still concerns and still problems. In September of that year, a young man in Austin, Georgia, was killed simply because he voted in the primary election. Also in that year, among Texas voters, a poll was taken, and 34% of them said they would vote for a white supremacy candidate. Now, this is at a time shortly after the white primary has been challenged, and also because in 1948, the Democratic Party under Truman, adopts a very pro-civil rights platform for the upcoming 1948 election. In 1950, a case from Texas, Sweet versus Painter. This is out of Houston, Texas. A Houston post office worker who had served in the military, an African-American gentleman, wanted to enroll in law school, and the only law school at the time was the University of Texas at Austin. That was the only law school in Texas at the time. But he was not allowed in because he was African American. And so he successfully, along with the help of the NAACP, launched a lawsuit that eventually made its way to the Supreme Court and ends up in being Sweatt versus Painter, which desegregates graduate education. One of the ways that Texas tried to get around this and tried to avoid this lawsuit was by establishing a school in Houston that is now known as Texas Southern University. Another case, and you see a picture of the lawyers and defendant on the left, was that of Hernandez v. Texas. This was the first time Mexican-American civil rights had reached the Supreme Court, and this was a case over jury selections. It turned out in the South Texas town of Edna, Texas, that Mexican-American jurors were not allowed to participate. Mexican Americans were kept off the jury rolls. And so if you were tried and brought to court and you were Mexican American, were you really being tried by a jury of your peers if Mexican Americans could not participate in the jury process? So you were basically being judged by an all-white jury, which may have been segregationist in their mindset or racist in their mindset. And so this case went before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed, and this ended segregation and exclusion of minorities from the jury rolls. In 1955, a case shocked the world, and this was the murder of 15-year-old Emmett Till. Emmett Till was from Chicago, and he was visiting his grandfather in Mississippi and was accused of whistling at a white woman who worked in a store. Her husband and some of his friends kidnapped him, tortured, and murdered him. They found his body a few days later, and they buried him, but this time they had the casket open, and photos were taken of his mutilated body and published in national African American magazines to show the lengths to which segregationists and racists would go in the South to attack African Americans. And this had a ripple effect and is sometimes seen as the incident that really launched the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Another incident that happened was we tend to think about Rosa Parks beginning the challenge of segregated buses. But actually, a few years before the Rosa Parks incident, Sarah Keyes had been sitting in a bus and was asked to move to the back when they went over the Mason-Dixon line, and she refused. And so this ended up as being a Supreme Court case, Sarah Keyes versus Carolina Coach Company. The issue came down in 1955, but it was not widely enforced. And so in December of 1955, Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat for white bus riders, and this started the Montgomery bus boycott. The Keyes case was regarding interstate travel. Rosa Parks was against inner city travel. So it was a difference. One was going across state lines. Rosa Parks was what happens with interstate. And the Montgomery bus boycott, which went on for a year, a little over a year, finally ended. Browder versus Gale, which had said that segregating of buses and other means of transportation was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The most well-known civil rights victory of the time was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And the decision was unanimous from the Supreme Court that the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, where separate but equal was deemed constitutional, had to be overturned. So this unanimous decision by the Supreme Court was deeply influenced by tests run by psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark, the so-called doll test. And you see on the right here a picture of Kenneth Clark, Dr. Clark, with a young African-American child, and he has the child looking at two dolls, one black, one white. And what they would do is they asked a series of children, which is the good doll, which is the bad doll, which doll is pretty, which doll is ugly, which doll is done a bad thing, which doll has done a good thing. And overwhelmingly, it was always the African-American doll that was the bad, the ugly, the doll that had done something wrong, whereas the white doll was the good doll. And so what Kenneth and Mamie Clark suggested was that discrimination and segregation had long taught African American people that they were bad. And this started, the Clark said, in the schools. And so this was the basis for much of the decision and much of the influence of why school segregation was bad. As a result of Brown versus Board of Education, there was a lot of resistance. This idea of massive resistance was the South's strategy on not complying with the Brown decision. And in fact, the next year, in 1955, the so-called Brown II decision said that integration had to occur with all deliberate speed. But there was still resistance. You had the development of the Southern Manifesto. This was a document signed by many Southern congressmen and politicians saying that they would not fall in to what the Supreme Court said, that they had states' rights to determine whether or not segregation would exist. And you had two incidents over school integration, one in Mansfield, Texas, just south of Fort Worth, and another, of course, in Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1957, finally, you did have a Civil Rights Act passed, the first one passed in 100 years since the Civil War era. But there was little enforcement power. And so the effects of that Civil Rights Act were quite limited. That's all for the lecture today, and next lecture we'll pick up on the 1960s.